I was 18 the night my mother tore my MIT acceptance letter in half. The sound of heavy cardstock giving way under her hands is something you never really unhear. She dropped the 2 jagged pieces onto our laminate kitchen counter. "This is not who we are," she said. Her voice was flat, empty of anything resembling an apology. "In my family, the eldest daughter stays home. She marries early. She manages a household. My grandmother did it. My mother, Sharon, did it. I was supposed to be next. I waited until the house was asleep. At 4 o'clock in the morning, under the dull hum of the bathroom exhaust fan, I laid the pieces on the porcelain sink and aligned the edges. I taped my future back together with clear packing tape. At 5 o'clock, I walked out the front door carrying a single duffel bag of clothes I had paid for myself. I did not leave a note. Before I explain how that single roll of packing tape led to the most expensive lesson my family ever learned, welcome to Luke Vengeance. If you are listening to this, you probably know what it feels like to have your potential treated as a threat by the people supposed to nurture it. How old were you when you realized you had to build your own safety net? Drop your age in the comments and hit subscribe. 5 years later, the air in my living room smells like ozone and pine needles. I am 23. I live in a fortified cedar cabin 20 miles outside of Juneau, Alaska. The windows are triple-paned glass. The locks are reinforced steel. Outside, the temperature hovers near zero, and the snowpack stretches unbroken toward the tree line. In Pennsylvania, the air always felt borrowed, suffocating. In Juneau, the isolation is a tangible asset. I like the cold. It keeps things preserved. It keeps people away. I work remotely as a financial data architect for a private equity firm in Seattle. My job is built on verifiable algorithms, numbers summed to a distinct total. Data packets either route correctly or they fail. There is no room for interpretation, no space for guilt. In my server, the cooling fans emit a steady, predictable drone. The server racks blink with green and amber status lights monitoring fractional shifts in global capital. I keep my physical network logs stacked on a steel desk held down by a heavy antique brass paperweight. It is a solid, cold object. It serves a single specific purpose. I appreciate things that do exactly what they are designed to do. My phone buzzed against the desk metal, a short, sharp vibration. I did not recognize the Pennsylvania area code at first, but I recognized the demanding cadence of the text that followed. "Hey, Clara, it has been a long time. We need to talk." It was my sister Megan. We had not exchanged a single word since the morning I left our mother's house. 5 years of silence broken on a random Tuesday in November. A second text arrived before I could process the first. "It is about Sophia. She needs your help. Sophia is her daughter, my niece, a girl I barely knew." I picked up the heavy brass paperweight, turning it over in my palm, feeling the cold metal absorb the heat from my skin. A request for help from my family never meant what the words suggested. It always meant an invoice was coming. I watched the cursor blink on my phone screen. 5 years ago, I vanished into the snow to avoid becoming a copy of my mother. Now, my older sister was reaching out using the exact same emotional hooks our family had perfected over decades. The brass paperweight in my hand was cold. I set it down beside my mechanical keyboard. A new message chimed, breaking the quiet hum of my server room. "Check your email. I just sent over Sophia's college prep materials." I swiveled my ergonomic chair toward my secondary monitor. My inbox showed a new message from an address I had blocked long ago. It bypassed my security filters because Megan had created a brand new iCloud account specifically for this interaction. The subject line read, "Sophia's Future." I clicked open the attached PDF file. It spanned 3 pages of dense text. Megan explained in the body of the email that my 16-year-old niece had been identified as a gifted student by an independent academic recruiter. According to Megan, Sophia needed $60,000 to secure a spot in an elite early admission preparatory pipeline. The number sat on the high-definition screen in stark black font. $60,000. That is not an educational loan. That is a down payment on a commercial property. That is a median annual salary. To ask an estranged sibling for that level of capital after 5 years of total silence requires a specific kind of entitlement. The second attachment was a personal essay supposedly written by Sophia herself, detailing her academic aspirations. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold steel of the desk, and began to read. My profession as a financial data architect requires me to hunt for inconsistencies in corporate disclosures. I look for the decimal shifted one space to the wrong column or the authorization date that predates a digital signature. Human behavior always leaves a paper trail. People construct lies, but they rarely construct flawless data. I read the first paragraph, then I read the second. A strange friction settled in my chest. The phrasing was entirely wrong. The essay spoke about synergizing cross-functional disciplines and curating a bespoke collegiate experience to maximize personal branding. It detailed a desire to leverage core competencies in a shifting macroeconomic landscape. I stared at the glowing pixels. A 16-year-old girl from rural Pennsylvania does not write like a desperate millennial marketing manager pitching a timeshare property. A high school junior might talk about changing the world, escaping her hometown, or discovering a passion. She does not use corporate boardroom buzzwords. I cross-reference this vocabulary against basic linguistic models I use for sentiment analysis. The sentence structure was rigid. It was padded with archaic filler words designed to sound intelligent to someone who had never actually navigated a university admissions process. Megan wrote this essay. She fabricated her own daughter's voice to extract capital from the sister she had spent her entire life ignoring. I did not feel a sudden rush of betrayal. Betrayal requires a foundation of existing trust. Instead, I felt the cool, familiar clarity of an audit locking into place. I opened a reply window and typed a response, measuring every single keystroke. I kept my tone professional, stripped of any familial warmth or shared history. I wrote that I was genuinely impressed by Sophia's ambition. I stated I would be willing to fully fund a 529 college savings plan in Sophia's name. I explained the mechanics of the financial vehicle clearly. A 529 plan guarantees the invested funds can only be distributed directly to an accredited educational institution for qualified tuition and boarding expenses. The money remains locked away from parents or guardians. It is a secure, tax-advantaged pipeline straight to the university billing department. I hit send. I turned my head to watch the snow hitting the triple-paned window glass. The Alaskan winter is unforgiving, but it operates by strict rules. If you prepare, you survive. If you are careless, you freeze. My family preferred to be careless and demand someone else provide the heat. The reply arrived in under 3 minutes. Megan did not express relief. She did not say thank you. Her text messages came in a rapid-fire burst of jagged, incomplete sentences. A 529 is too restrictive, Clara. The prep program requires liquid capital for independent tutors and travel expenses. We need the cash wired directly into my checking account by Friday. I am her mother. I know how to manage her funds. Do not make this difficult. Just wire the money. The demand for a direct wire transfer to a personal checking account is the universal hallmark of a scam. It bypasses institutional oversight. It eliminates the possibility of a transaction chargeback. Megan wanted untraceable liquid cash fast. I minimized my email client and opened a secure encrypted browser window. I navigated to the Pennsylvania County Recorder of Deeds public database. Data is beautiful because it lacks an ego. It tells the exact story people spend their entire lives trying to bury under polite smiles and fake essays. I entered Megan and her husband Todd's legal names into the search query fields. Todd was a man I remembered only as a loud, imposing presence at holiday dinners. He was always pitching a new, guaranteed investment scheme or day trading strategy that never materialized into actual wealth. I remembered him driving a leased luxury sedan while asking my mother to borrow money for groceries. I filtered the search results, focusing exclusively on civil filings and municipal judgments within the last 12 months. The clunky government website took a few seconds to load the query. The screen populated with a short list of PDS scans. I clicked the top file, waiting for the image rendering software to clear the blurred edges of the document. It was a notice of default. I scrolled down and clicked the second file, a lis pendens. I pulled up the local tax assessor records for their suburban colonial house, matching the property identification numbers across the legal filings. The math crystallized in front of my eyes. Megan and Todd were exactly 90 days away from foreclosure. They had defaulted on 3 consecutive mortgage payments. The principal balance combined with compounding penalty fees painted a disastrous financial portrait. The bank had initiated the pre-foreclosure legal process 30 days prior. The legal notices indicated a sheriff's sale was imminent if the arrears were not cured. I sat back in my chair. The drone of the server cooling fans filled the quiet space of my office. The puzzle pieces snapped together, forming a bleak, ugly picture of domestic failure. Sophia was not attending an elite college prep pipeline. There were no independent tutors waiting for a check. There was no synergistic academic journey. My older sister and her husband were drowning in debt, and they viewed my Alaskan bank accounts as a convenient life raft. The $60,000 Megan demanded was the exact sum required to cure the mortgage default, pay off the late penalties, and halt the property seizure. Megan was using her own teenage child as a human shield to commit financial fraud against her estranged sister. She typed out a fake essay, wrapped it in the language of higher education, and tried to sell me a lie. I reached for the brass paperweight again. The cold metal felt grounding against my skin. The sheer audacity of their strategy was fascinating from a purely analytical standpoint. They assumed I was still the quiet, obedient girl taping paper together in a bathroom. They assumed physical distance had not changed my internal programming. I prepared to type a final, definitive refusal. I was going to articulate exactly what I had found in the county civil records. I was going to list the docket numbers of their foreclosure notices. I was going to permanently close the door they had foolishly tried to pry open and let them face the consequences of their own financial mismanagement. Then my phone illuminated the dark surface of the desk. A rhythmic, harsh vibration broke the stillness of the room. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across my knuckles. The caller ID flashed a name I had not seen on a digital screen in half a decade. It was not Megan calling to beg or negotiate. It was Sharon. The screen glowed with a name that belonged to another lifetime. Sharon. My mother did not text. She did not send emails. She operated strictly through real-time vocal pressure, where she could manipulate the tempo of a conversation. I let the phone vibrate 3 times. I watched the caller identification pulse against the dark aluminum chassis of my desk. A younger version of me would have felt a spike of adrenaline. The girl taping paper together in a bathroom would have let the call go to voicemail, terrified of the impending lecture. The data architect sitting in a fortified Alaskan cabin simply pressed accept. I held the device to my ear and said nothing. In hostile corporate negotiations, silence is a vacuum. Amateurs will always rush to fill a vacuum, usually by offering a concession or revealing their actual motive. I waited. "Clara, you are making your sister cry." Those were her opening words. No greeting, no inquiry about my health or my life across the last half-decade. She launched straight into the assigned roles we had played since childhood. Megan was the victim. I was the instigator. Sharon was the righteous judge. Megan asked for an educational contribution. I replied. My tone was flat, matching the drone of the server cooling fans behind me. I offered to establish a dedicated 529 savings account. It is a secure, tax-advantaged vehicle. "Stop talking like a bank teller," Sharon snapped. Her breath hissed through the receiver, carrying the faint static of a long-distance connection. "She is your niece. She is blood. You've been sitting up there in the ice hoarding your little paychecks while your family struggles. Megan needs the cash wired by Friday. You owe us this much." The concept of owing my family anything was a fascinating arithmetic. I paid for my own clothes since I was 14. I bought my own groceries. I funded my own escape. But narcissistic parents operate on a phantom ledger. In their minds, the basic requirements of keeping a child alive constitute a permanent, unpayable debt. Sharon was trying to collect a family tax for the crime of my independence. "I owe you nothing," I stated. The words were not born of anger. They were a simple statement of fact, like reading a zero balance on a spreadsheet. Sharon inhaled sharply. The pitch of her voice climbed. "You are so selfish, Clara. You have always been this way, just looking out for yourself. Even back then when you thought you were too good for this family. You are still holding on to that stupid piece of paper, aren't you? That little disagreement we had when you were a teenager." She meant the MIT acceptance letter. She referred to the act of destroying my collegiate future as a little disagreement. It was the classic gaslighting directive. Shrink the abuse until it looks like a microscopic inconvenience. Blame the victim for having a long memory. I did not take the bait. Defending my past trauma would only validate her premise that the past was up for debate. I kept my focus tethered to the present financial transaction. The county civil court records are public domain, Mom. I spoke the words with deliberate, rhythmic precision. I pulled the docket numbers 10 minutes ago. Megan and Todd are 90 days late on their mortgage. They are facing a sheriff's sale. The $60,000 is not for college prep. It is to cure their default. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. For 4 entire seconds, there was nothing but the faint crackle of cellular towers bridging the thousands of miles between a failing Pennsylvania suburb and a frozen Alaskan mountain. I had presented undeniable, verifiable data. I had removed her ability to construct a favorable narrative. When the data contradicts the narrative, a rational person adjusts their perspective. A manipulator changes their weapon. Sharon pivoted. The transition was so fast it was physically jarring. The harsh, commanding matriarch vanished. A wet, trembling sound replaced the anger. "Oh, Clara," her voice cracked, carrying the fragile cadence of a heartbroken elder. "Clara, please, we are just so scared. Megan is terrified she is going to lose the house. Todd is under so much pressure. We did not want to burden you with our failures. We just wanted to protect Sophia from the fallout." I listened to the performance. The tears sounded genuine. The tremor in her throat was expertly calibrated. If I had not spent my professional life dissecting fraudulent corporate empathy, I might have believed the shift. But I noted the timeline. She only began weeping when the lie was exposed. The tears were not an expression of sorrow. They were a tactical retreat. "I am sorry Megan is facing foreclosure," I said. "I will not be wiring liquid cash to her personal account to subsidize Todd's poor investment strategies. My offer for the 529 educational plan remains open for Sophia. That is my final proposal." The weeping stopped. The mechanical efficiency of her recovery was chilling. The tears evaporated, leaving a cold, hardened resolve. "You cannot hide behind a screen forever, Clara." Sharon dropped the fragile act entirely. "I am your mother. I am not going to let you abandon your sister when she is on the brink of ruin. I booked a flight. I am coming to Juneau. We are going to sit down face to face and reconnect. We are going to talk sense into you." The declaration hung in the air. She was weaponizing her physical presence. In her mind, my boundaries only existed because of geography. She believed if she invaded my space, she could revert me to the compliant 18-year-old girl who fixed broken things in silence. "Do not board that plane," I warned. The cedar walls of my cabin seemed to absorb the coldness of my voice. "I have not invited you. My property is private. If you travel here, you will find a locked door. I will not host you. I will not let you inside. I will see you soon, sweetheart." The call disconnected. I lowered the phone, setting it face down on the steel desk. My pulse remained steady. I turned my chair toward the bank of monitors displaying my external security feeds. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the driveway in a thick white layer. The isolation of the Alaskan wilderness was designed to be a deterrent. It requires 4 flights and a specialized rental vehicle with chain tires just to reach the base of my mountain road. Sharon believed she could simply arrive and conquer my space. She did not understand the architecture of the life I had built. I reached for my coffee mug. The ceramic was lukewarm. Before my fingers grazed the handle, a sharp, high-pitched chime echoed through the server room. It was not a text message. It was not an email notification. It was a dedicated hardware alert. On my third monitor, a red notification banner dropped across the top of the screen. The text read, "Perimeter breach." The motion sensor at my lower gate half a mile down the private access road had triggered. I sat perfectly still. Sharon had just claimed she booked a flight. She was thousands of miles away in another time zone. She could not possibly be triggering a motion sensor in the Alaskan tundra right now. I tapped a keyboard, bringing up the live feed from the gate camera. The lens was partially obscured by fresh frost, but the infrared night vision pierced the falling snow. A heavy, dark shape idled at the edge of the tree line. Someone was already here. My mother was not coming alone, and the vanguard had arrived early to test the ice. The infrared camera feed painted the idling vehicle in ghostly shades of white and gray. It was a heavy-duty pickup truck sitting at the edge of my lower gate half a mile down the mountain. The exhaust plumed in thick, dense clouds against the freezing Alaskan air. I zoomed the lens, observing the driver's side door pop open. A figure stepped out onto the compacted snow. He did not move with the balanced, cautious gait of a local resident accustomed to the ice. He slipped, grabbing the metal door frame to stabilize his weight. I tapped a command sequence into my terminal to enhance the facial recognition parameters. The software cleared the visual noise of the falling snow. The face filled the screen. It was Todd Megan's husband. My brother-in-law was a man whose entire identity was constructed on phantom capital. He spent the last decade trading margin accounts from his suburban living room, chasing volatile tech stocks and cryptocurrency spikes. He always projected the illusion of impending wealth while quietly bleeding his family dry. He was the kind of man who leased a luxury sedan while asking my mother to borrow money for basic groceries. I authorized the gate release. The heavy steel barrier rolled back on its motorized track. I wanted to see exactly what kind of desperation drove a failed day trader to cross a continent uninvited. The truck tires crunched over the gravel and ice, navigating the steep incline toward my cabin. I stood up from my steel desk. Ghost, my Alaskan Malamute, rose from his spot near the cast-iron heating stove. He did not bark. He let out a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The dog sensed the shift in the atmospheric tension before the vehicle even parked. Todd stomped into my mudroom, tracking gray slush across the waterproof rubber matting. He wore a brand-new designer parka that looked like it had never been tested by actual weather. His smile was wide, showing too many teeth resembling a salesman greeting a skeptical Mark. "Clara, look at this place." He announced, his voice too loud for the quiet structure. "A real winter wonderland." I thought I would drop in and check on my favorite sister-in-law. He claimed he was up north for an early-season caribou hunt with some old college friends. I analyzed his physical presentation. I looked at his hands. The skin was clean, uncalloused. I looked at his footwear. He wore insulated urban hiking boots rated for a brisk walk to a coffee shop, not the deep, unforgiving backcountry. He brought no rifle case. He carried no survival gear. His story was a hollow shell fabricated to justify an invasion. I invited him no further than the kitchen island holding the perimeter line of my personal space. I poured black coffee into a ceramic mug and slid it across the cold granite counter. He wrapped his fingers around the hot cup. Despite the chill still radiating from his expensive coat, a thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead. The ambient temperature in the cabin was a regulated 68 degrees. Todd was perspiring from internal pressure. He drank the coffee too fast, wincing as the dark liquid burned his throat. He started talking, filling the silence with rapid nervous chatter about inflation, the shifting housing market, and the economy. Then the facade cracked just a fraction. He looked down at the granite surface, his confident mask slipping to reveal the terror underneath. "Banks are locking up credit these days, Clara," he muttered, shaking his head. "A guy tries to float a simple bridge loan and suddenly he has to deal with private lenders. You would not believe the interest rates these private loan sharks demand. It is predatory. They do not care about your collateral, they just want their pound of flesh." The auditor inside my mind registered the specific phrasing, "private loan sharks." Normal people facing a standard mortgage foreclosure do not reference predatory unbanked lenders. Todd was not just losing a suburban house to a traditional financial institution. He owed money to people who operated outside the legal banking system. That realization explained the sheer urgency of Megan's text messages. That explained why they demanded a $60,000 wire transfer by Friday. It was not tuition money. It was a ransom to keep Todd out of physical danger. I turned my back to place the glass coffee pot back on the heating element, allowing him to think he had a moment of unobserved freedom. My kitchen features a polished steel backsplash behind the stove. It acts as a perfect, muted mirror. I watched his reflection in the metal surface. Todd stepped away from the kitchen island. His eyes darted across the open floor plan, calculating the value of the electronics, the solar battery banks, the reinforced architectural upgrades. He drifted down the short hallway toward the restricted wing of the cabin. He stopped in front of the solid core door, sealing my server room. That door secures the financial data architecture I manage for my Seattle firm. Todd reached out and grasped the heavy titanium handle. He twisted the metal, pressing his shoulder against the wood, pushing hard to test the internal deadbolt. Ghost stepped into the hallway. The Malamute bared his teeth, curling his upper lip to expose sharp white canines. The growl deepened, shifting from a territorial warning to a distinct promise of violence. Todd snatched his hand away from the handle, spinning around with a nervous, hollow laugh. "Just looking for the bathroom," he stammered, taking a quick step backward. I walked into the hallway, stopping beside my dog. "The bathroom is by the front entrance," I stated. "Your coffee is finished, Todd. The mountain roads ice over quickly after dusk. You need to leave now before your rental truck slides into a ravine." He tried to protest. He attempted to deploy more fake charm to extend his scouting mission. The icy authority in my stare shut him down. He retreated to the mudroom, zipping his designer parka with trembling fingers. I watched him reverse out of the driveway, the red taillights fading into the blinding white storm. I secured the heavy deadbolts on the front entrance and returned to the quiet sanctuary of my server room. I sat down, reaching for the brass paperweight to ground myself. Before my fingers touched the cold metal, the primary security dashboard on my center monitor shifted. The standard green diagnostic interface vanished. It was replaced by a flashing crimson alert. A secondary unrecognized node had just appeared on my internal local area network. Todd did not twist the server room door handle just to snoop. The rattling was a deliberate physical distraction. I brought up the localized hardware map, tracing the foreign signal jumping across my Wi-Fi channels. It originated from the front of the house. I walked back out and meticulously inspected the wall outlets hidden behind the heavy coats in the mudroom. Plugged discreetly into a lower socket just above the baseboard was a small white plastic square. It resembled a standard generic phone charging block. I recognized the hardware modifications immediately. It was a Rogue Raspberry Pi, a customized network packet sniffer designed to intercept and clone wireless data transmissions. The scout had not just tested my physical boundaries, he had breached the digital perimeter. I crouched on the cold rubber matting of the entryway, analyzing the small white plastic square plugged into the baseboard outlet. A standard homeowner would panic and unplug the device. An amateur would destroy the casing to stop the intrusion. A data architect leverages the vulnerability. Unplugging the hardware would instantly alert the infiltrator that their surveillance had been discovered. I did not touch the unit. The plastic was warm, emitting a faint thermal signature, indicating active data transmission. I left it drawing power from my electrical grid and walked back down the quiet hallway to my glowing server racks. I needed to cage the infection. I settled into my ergonomic chair and opened the central command terminal. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard, typing a rapid sequence of administrative overrides. I partitioned a restricted subnetwork segment. In cybersecurity architecture, this is known as a honeypot. It is a digital quarantine zone designed to look and function exactly like a genuine financial database. I stripped the rogue device's access credentials, removing its ability to touch my real banking keys. I trapped the signal inside a mirrored simulation. The packet sniffer could roam freely through the network architecture, but it would only see the fabricated walls of the glass cage I built around it. Once the containment protocol stabilized, I began dissecting the transmission logs. I needed to understand what Todd had programmed the malware to find. The injected code was executing a series of automated queries, scanning my localized search history, and parsing my cached browser files. The text scrolled across my secondary monitor, revealing a highly specific string of search keywords. Alaskan real estate transfers, Juneau County property deeds, remote property quitclaim processes. I leaned back, listening to the rhythmic hum of the cooling fans. The logic seemed straightforward, given the evidence I had already uncovered. Megan and Todd were losing their suburban colonial house to foreclosure. My cedar structure sat on 10 acres of pristine, unencumbered wilderness. It was a hard physical asset worth $500,000 free and clear. I assumed they intended to somehow leverage my property title. Perhaps they planned to pressure me into signing over a percentage of the deed to satisfy their private creditors. It was an ugly, desperate strategy. It was also the wrong conclusion. I just did not possess the missing variables to see the true picture yet. I traced the outgoing destination of the stolen data packets. The telemetry did not bounce through sophisticated overseas proxy servers or encrypted dark web tunnels. The routing protocol was sloppy. It traced an undeniable geographic line across the continent, landing on a residential internet service provider node located in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. The exact coordinates mapped directly to Megan's living room router. My older sister was sitting in a house she was about to lose, actively attempting to siphon my digital identity. I decided to keep her occupied. A hungry predator is unpredictable. A fed predator becomes lazy and complacent. I utilized an algorithmic randomizer to generate several gigabytes of synthetic financial data. I created dummy bank statements, building ledgers that displayed high-value routing numbers and locked escrow accounts. The information was entirely fictitious but mathematically plausible to an untrained eye. I labeled the folders with enticing names like Offshore Holding Alpha and Liquid Routing Bravo. I pushed the dummy files into the sandbox environment. The rogue hardware consumed the bait, immediately transmitting the useless encrypted junk data back to the East Coast. Megan and Todd would spend the next 3 days trying to crack files that contained nothing but random alphanumeric noise. The digital front was secured. I turned my attention back to the initial vulnerability. The entry point of any financial scam is always the foundational premise. If the network hardware was hostile, the $60,000 college essay was a fabrication. I picked up my phone and adjusted the caller identification output to display a generic Seattle corporate prefix. I calculated the time zone difference. It was late afternoon on the East Coast. I dialed the main administrative number for the regional high school Sophia attended. A secretary answered the line. I adopted the crisp, polite cadence of a corporate philanthropy director. I explained I represented a private equity scholarship foundation verifying applicant criteria for an upcoming grant cycle. I asked to be transferred to the junior class guidance counselor. A man named Mr. Peterson picked up the receiver. I provided Sophia's legal name and inquired about her early admission preparatory trajectory. I deliberately referenced the specific synergy and branding concepts Megan had stuffed into the PDF essay. Mr. Peterson offered a confused chuckle. "There must be a mix-up on your roster, Ms. Morgan," he said. "Sophia is a bright kid, but she has zero interest in a traditional 4-year university track." I kept my voice neutral, encouraging the counselor to elaborate. "She explicitly opted out of the standardized test prep seminars last month," he continued. "Sophia is enrolled in our vocational partnership program. She spends 3 afternoons a week at the regional airfield. She wants to be an aviation mechanic. She is brilliant with an engine block. I have never seen that student write a single essay about personal branding. Her last paper was a technical teardown of a turbine intake manifold." I thanked Mr. Peterson for his time and disconnected the call. The silence in the cabin felt heavier, pressing against my eardrums. Megan was not just lying to me to secure a loan. She was erasing her own daughter's identity to construct a financial shell company. Sophia did not want early admission to an elite university. Sophia wanted to fix airplanes. Megan drafted that ridiculous corporate essay to extract $60,000 under the guise of maternal devotion, while her kid was out turning wrenches on a runway. The depth of the betrayal settled into my bones, chilling me faster than the wind howling outside the window. This was not a fractured family reaching out for a lifeline. This was a coordinated heist. The scouting mission from Todd, the network breach, the fake essay, the manufactured tears from Sharon. Every element was a calculated mechanism designed to drain my resources to cover the failures of a toxic marriage. I reached for the brass paperweight. The cool, heavy geometry of the object grounded my racing thoughts. The internal auditor protocol took total command of my nervous system. I was no longer a sister or an estranged daughter. I was a target. I was going to dismantle their operation piece by piece, using their own momentum against them. I began formulating the next step of the countermeasure. I needed them to believe their plan was functioning perfectly. I needed them to walk willingly into the trap. Before I could draft the legal framework on my terminal, my tertiary monitor flashed. It was not a network alert. It was the physical perimeter feed from the upper driveway. The snowstorm outside had escalated into a blinding squall, dropping visibility to less than 50 feet. The wind battered the reinforced glass of my windows. Through the swirling white static, a pair of intense halogen headlights pierced the darkness. A large, dark rental SUV crawled up the steep, icy incline of my property. Todd had scouted the terrain. He had planted the bug. Now the main force was arriving to execute the extraction. The heavy vehicle parked near my covered wood rack. The engine cut off, leaving only the sound of the storm. The driver's side and passenger side doors opened simultaneously. Sharon and Megan stepped out into the Alaskan night. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy entrance door inward. The frigid air rushed into the mudroom, carrying the sharp scent of pine-frozen earth and impending snow. It is a clean smell. It purifies the lungs and sharpens the mind. Then Sharon stepped across the threshold, and the pristine Alaskan atmosphere died. She brought a cloud of heavy floral perfume, a synthetic, suffocating scent that clung to her wool coat. It was the exact same cheap department store fragrance she wore during my childhood. It used to signal a mandatory compliance protocol when I was young. Megan followed right behind her, stomping snow off her boots with an exaggerated, theatrical sigh. Neither woman wore appropriate gear for the geography. Megan had a fashionable pea coat. Sharon wore thin leather gloves, useless against a 0-degree wind chill. Their teeth chattered. Their skin looked pale and sallow under the harsh mudroom lighting. They looked like tourists who had taken a wrong turn, but their eyes were moving with calculated intent. They did not wait for an invitation to proceed. They pushed past me into the main living space. Intruders often use physical movement to claim territory and establish a psychological baseline. Sharon walked straight to the kitchen island and shifted a stack of my mail 3 into the left. Megan dropped her oversized designer handbag onto the dining table, pushing my laptop aside. They were marking the environment, testing the structural integrity of my boundaries. "It is freezing up here, Clara," Sharon complained, unwrapping her scarf and tossing it over one of my dining chairs. "How do you live in this isolation?" I did not offer them coats or a warm drink. I leaned against the wooden doorframe, keeping my distance. "You chose to book a flight," I replied. My tone offered zero friction. It was a flat surface they could not grip. Megan unzipped her coat, revealing a nervous, rigid posture. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick faux leather binder. She laid it flat on the wood grain. "We are not here to argue," Clara Megan said, aiming for a conciliatory pitch, but her vocal cords tightened under the strain. "We are here for Sophia. We want to do this the right way. We brought the paperwork to show you we are serious." She slid the binder across the table. I walked over and opened the cover. The pages were filled with colorful bar charts and generic financial projections. The title page read, "Sophia Educational Investment Portfolio." It looked like a brochure printed at a local retail shipping center. The charts showed compounding interest curves and tuition trajectories. It was a visual prop designed to mimic institutional legitimacy. The final page contained a legal authorization form. It required my signature to release the $60,000 wire directly into Megan's personal custody, granting her total discretionary control over the capital. A signature is not required for a 529 plan deposit. I stated, analyzing the fraudulent document. I can fund the educational account directly through the brokerage portal. This form grants you unrestricted access to the liquid funds. Megan crossed her arms. "I am her guardian, Clara. I have to manage the disbursements for the private tutors and the travel. You cannot just lock it away in an escrow account. The program requires liquid assets on hand. We are trying to synergize her opportunities." She used the exact same buzzword from the fake email essay. The repetition confirmed the script. I glanced up from the binder. Megan's oversized handbag sat open on the table just a few inches from my hand. Tucked inside the interior zipper pocket was a bright yellow carbon copy slip. My profession requires a trained visual acuity for specific financial documentation. I recognized the standardized formatting of a title loan receipt. The text printed across the top margin read, "Keystone Title Loans and Exchange." The itemized collateral listed below was a 1968 Ford F-100. The disparate data points snapped together, illuminating the true, terrifying depth of their ruin. That specific classic truck belonged to Sophia's biological father. He passed away when Sophia was an infant. He had spent 3 years meticulously restoring that engine block before his heart failed. The vehicle was parked under a tarp in Megan's garage for a decade, intended as a milestone gift for Sophia when she earned her driver's license. Megan and Todd had just pawned the only physical memory the girl had of her dead father. Last-minute peak winter airline tickets to Alaska, along with a heavy-duty rental SUV, are incredibly expensive. They had no cash reserves. They were facing foreclosure. They cannibalized the child's actual physical inheritance to fund this extortion attempt. I looked at my sister. The desperation radiating from her was a tangible force. She had traded her daughter's legacy for a plane ticket to steal from her own blood. "I am not signing this document," I said, closing the binder with a firm snap. "I am not transferring any capital to your checking account." The fake familial warmth evaporated from the room. The transition was instantaneous. Sharon stepped forward, her facial muscles hardening into sharp, predatory lines. "You will sign it, Clara," my mother ordered. Her voice dropped an octave, losing the fragile victim cadence she used on the phone. "We did not fly across the continent to be lectured by an arrogant, ungrateful child. We are not leaving this cabin until you do exactly what you are told." She took another step, closing the physical distance, attempting to use her physical height to intimidate me. 5 years ago, I would have flinched. Today, I just watched the vein pulse in her neck, calculating her elevated heart rate. Before I could issue a verbal response, the emergency weather radio mounted on the kitchen wall activated. A shrill, piercing alarm tone cut through the tense silence of the cabin. Ghost stood up from his spot near the stove, his ears pinning back at the harsh frequency. An automated digital voice began broadcasting a severe National Weather Service alert. A whiteout blizzard was currently touching down across the Juneau perimeter. Wind gusts were projected to exceed 60 miles per hour, creating zero visibility conditions. All mountain access roads were officially closed by the State Trooper Division. Snow accumulation was expected to reach 3 feet before dawn, rendering any vehicular travel impossible. The broadcast warned all residents to shelter in place and secure backup generator power. The alarm tone faded, leaving only the escalating roar of the wind outside. The cedar planks of my cabin groaned under the sudden atmospheric pressure. I looked at the digital red readout on the radio panel. Then I looked back at the 2 women standing in my kitchen. The storm had sealed the geographic trap. No one was driving down that mountain road. My mother and sister had invaded my sanctuary to extract my wealth, and the Alaskan winter had just locked the heavy steel door behind them. We were trapped together. The whiteout conditions hit the mountain with kinetic force. The wind did not howl. It battered the cedar siding with a continuous, deafening roar, mimicking the sound of a freight train accelerating through a tunnel. The triple-paned glass of the windows vibrated within their reinforced frames. Outside, the world vanished into a chaotic swirl of blinding white static. The temperature plunged 30 degrees in under an hour, sealing the moisture into hardened layers of impenetrable ice. My mother and sister were marooned. The physical claustrophobia of the cabin immediately began to mirror the psychological siege they intended to orchestrate. A forced proximity strips away social conditioning. When people are trapped, their baseline operating protocols surface. Sharon and Megan operated on a platform of entitlement and spatial dominance. They began pacing the open floor plan. Sharon complained about the draft. Megan complained about the cellular reception. I ignored their grievances. I established my operating parameters. I locked the heavy solid core door to my server room, engaging the deadbolt and arming the biometric keypad. I secured my primary bedroom. I provided them with heavy wool blankets and directed them to the secondary guest quarters at the far end of the hallway. I did not sleep that first night. I initiated a biological auditing system. I slept in fragmented 2-hour shifts, resting in a seated position near the cast-iron stove. Ghost remained stationed at my feet. The Malamute understood the threat matrix. He did not close his eyes simultaneously with mine. We maintained a shared, continuous watch over the perimeter of my personal space. By the morning of the second day, the pressure inside the structure felt thicker than the barometric pressure outside. The storm showed zero signs of yielding. The snowpack had drifted halfway up the exterior walls. I stood in the kitchen preparing coffee. The process required grinding fresh beans and heating filtered water on the electric range. Sharon and Megan sat at the dining table. They spoke in hushed, urgent whispers whenever my back was turned, immediately shifting to fake, casual chatter the moment I faced them. They were performing a poorly rehearsed stage play. I poured the boiling water over the grounds. With my left hand, I slid my phone out of my pocket and rested it flat on the granite counter, hidden from their line of sight behind the coffee carafe. I opened a secure terminal application. While I played the stoic host, I actively decrypted the outbound network traffic captured in my digital sandbox. The rogue Raspberry Pi hardware Todd had planted was still diligently transmitting data back to the East Coast. Since the severe weather had degraded standard cellular towers, Megan was utilizing my local area network to push text-based messages through an encrypted web client. She assumed her communications were secure. She did not realize she was broadcasting directly through the digital quarantine zone I controlled. I parsed the intercepted packets, watching the raw text render on my small screen. The messages were directed to Todd. "The weather is a disaster. She will not sign the portfolio. The clock is ticking, Todd. We need to execute the primary contingency." "Did you finalize the backdated forms with the notary?" I read the text twice. Primary contingency, backdated forms. The language confirmed the college fund extortion was merely a preliminary tactic. A $60,000 wire transfer was their preferred outcome because it was fast and relatively clean. But they had constructed a secondary operational mechanism. They came equipped with a backup plan that required a fraudulent legal certification. I poured the dark coffee into 3 ceramic mugs. I handed 2 cups to the women sitting at my table. I did not betray a single fraction of the knowledge I had just acquired. I watched Sharon take a sip, noting the tremor in her knuckles. The facade of the confident matriarch was cracking under the strain of the isolation and the impending financial ruin waiting for them in Pennsylvania. I left them in the kitchen and walked down the hallway to my physical office space. This room functioned as my secondary workstation, housing archived paper records and tax documents stored in a heavy steel filing cabinet. I needed to retrieve a specific ledger to cross-reference a date from Megan's decrypted messages. I approached the steel cabinet. The visual anomaly registered before my hand reached the handle. The brass lock mechanism securing the top drawer was severely deformed. The surrounding gray steel bore fresh, bright scratches, exposing the raw iron underneath the factory paint. I knelt to examine this damage. Someone had attempted to bypass the locking cylinder using primitive brute force. The metal around the keyhole was dented inward. Smeared across the gouged steel were distinct golden yellow transfer marks. Soft metal had scraped against harder metal. I stood up and turned my head toward the steel desk sitting in the center of the room. The heavy antique brass paperweight was resting near the edge of the blotter. It was out of alignment by 4 inches. I picked up the brass object. The smooth, rounded base featured a fresh, deep structural gouge. During my brief sleep shift the previous night, Megan had prowled through the dark cabin. She had entered my office, found the heaviest blunt object available, and repeatedly bludgeoned the lock on my filing cabinet, attempting to gain access to my physical financial documents. The action painted a vivid portrait of unhinged desperation. She was trapped in a freezing cabin facing a predatory debt collector back home, and she was resorting to vandalism to locate a lifeline. She failed to breach the drawer. The industrial steel held, but the physical damage to my property fundamentally altered the geometry of the standoff. They were no longer just applying emotional leverage. They were crossing into criminal trespass and property destruction. I placed the brass paperweight exactly where I found it. I returned to the living room and spent the remainder of the daylight hours sitting quietly observing them. I watched their micro-expressions. I cataloged their nervous habits. Megan chewed the cuticle of her thumb. Sharon constantly checked the dead cellular signal on her device. They were lab rats pacing a glass maze, searching for an exit that did not exist. Night fell, covering the mountain in absolute darkness. The wind velocity increased, shrieking through the high pines. The cabin temperature remained stable, but the psychological temperature was freezing over. At 10:00, they retreated to the guest quarters. I heard the lock engage on their bedroom door. They were attempting to secure themselves against the environment they had invaded. I waited. The auditor knows that time is the ultimate truth serum. People can maintain a deception during the day, but exhaustion eventually forces compliance. I sat in my chair near the stove, listening to the structural settling of the timber frame. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the cabin was submerged in an artificial stillness. The storm outside provided a thick layer of acoustic camouflage. Ghost lay on the rug, his breathing slow and rhythmic. I stood up. I wore thick wool socks, silencing my footsteps against the hardwood flooring. I navigated the hallway, relying on spatial memory to avoid the specific floorboards I knew would creak under my body weight. I reached the door to the guest quarters. The lock they had engaged was a standard privacy knob designed for basic domestic boundaries. It was not a security-grade deadbolt. I slid a thin, flat steel tension tool from my pocket. I inserted the metal into the narrow gap between the door frame and the latch. A quiet, precise twist depressed the angled bolt. The door unlatched with a nearly imperceptible click. I pushed the wood inward a fraction of an inch at a time. The air inside the room was heavy, tainted by the lingering chemical residue of Sharon's floral perfume. The darkness was absolute. I tuned my hearing to the dual respiratory rhythms in the room. Sharon snored, producing a deep, steady rattle from the bed near the window. Megan breathed in shallow, rapid intervals from the secondary cot. They were both submerged in deep, rapid eye movement sleep cycles. I dropped to a crouch, scanning the floor level. Sharon's rolling suitcase rested near the closet. It was unzipped, the nylon cover folded back. I crept across the carpet, moving with agonizing slowness. I positioned myself beside the luggage. I ran my fingertips along the interior lining of the suitcase. I bypassed the folded sweaters and the cosmetic bags. I pressed my palm against the structural bottom panel. The fabric yielded slightly, revealing a hollow cavity beneath the rigid frame. It was a false compartment, a rudimentary smuggling tactic. I slid my fingers under the nylon seam and pried the panel upward. Tucked inside the concealed space, wrapped in a protective plastic sleeve, was a thick manila folder. I gripped the heavy paper stock. I pulled the folder free, lowering the false bottom back into place. I retreated from the room, executing the same silent, meticulous footwork, closing the door and re-engaging the privacy latch. I walked back to the kitchen, utilizing the dim amber glow of the stove embers for illumination. I placed the manila folder onto the granite island. The decrypted message about a primary contingency echoed in my prefrontal cortex. I opened the heavy paper cover, preparing to audit the exact blueprint of their betrayal. The manila folder felt unusually heavy in my hands. The weight of physical documentation always carries an inherent gravity. In my profession, a single sheet of paper can represent the total liquidation of a corporate entity or the preservation of generational wealth. I stood in the dim amber light of my kitchen island, turning the pages over one by one. I pulled my phone from my pocket, activating the high-definition camera. I captured digital copies of every single line, every signature block, every legal seal. I did not rely on memory. I relied on verifiable evidence. The contents were not related to a high school educational portfolio. They were no college prep schedules. There were no academic projections. The papers comprised a comprehensive, meticulously orchestrated legal assault. The primary document was a medical power of attorney. The header was formatted in standard, bold legal typeface, authorized for the jurisdiction of Pennsylvania, but drafted to execute interstate control. The text beneath the header was chilling. It granted Sharon total unrestricted proxy over my physical custody, medical treatment, and geographic location. The secondary document was a formal petition for emergency conservatorship. I traced my finger over the printed narrative detailing the grounds for the petition. It read like a work of pathological fiction. Megan and Sharon had constructed a timeline portraying my relocation to Alaska 5 years ago, not as a calculated career move, but as the initial symptom of a severe psychotic break. They cited my isolation, my fortified cabin, and my refusal to engage with family as evidence of severe mental deterioration. They painted a picture of a wealthy, erratic woman hoarding resources while losing her grip on reality. The final page contained a certification block. A bright blue circular stamp pressed into the lower right corner confirmed the authenticity of the signatures. It was the official seal of a public notary operating out of Pottsville, Pennsylvania. The date stamped beside the seal was backdated by 3 weeks. Todd had found a corrupt notary willing to certify a fraudulent document without my physical presence or my consent. The strategy was brutally effective. If I refused the $60,000 extortion for Sophia's fake college fund, they intended to trigger this primary contingency. They would present these documents to an Alaskan magistrate, claiming I was in immediate danger to myself. A temporary emergency conservatorship would grant Sharon instant access to my financial architecture. She would drain the accounts, wire the necessary funds to satisfy Todd's private loan sharks, and leave me legally stranded in a psychiatric holding facility, fighting a jurisdictional nightmare to regain control of my own life. I stared at the medical terminology weaponized against me on the page. The clinical phrasing caused a sudden sharp friction in my chest. A memory dislodged from the archived files of my childhood, rising to the surface with crystal clarity. I was 10 years old, sitting on the crinkling paper of an examination table in a sterile pediatric clinic. I felt perfectly healthy. I'd wanted to go to school to take a math proficiency exam. Sharon sat in the plastic chair beside me, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. The pediatrician, a tired man with silver hair, walked into the room holding a clipboard. Sharon launched into a performance of maternal terror. She described violent sleepwalking episodes, severe chronic abdominal pain, and unprovoked screaming fits. She fabricated an entirely fictitious medical history for me right in front of my face. When I opened my mouth to tell the doctor I felt fine, Sharon dug her manicured fingernails directly into my thigh, silencing me with a sharp, painful pinch hidden beneath the folds of my jacket. She wept, asking the doctor to prescribe heavy sedatives. She craved the attention, the sympathy, the control of managing a sick child. The doctor hesitated, but the sheer volume of her panic eroded his professional skepticism. He wrote the script. I spent the next 6 months living in a chemical fog, while Sharon received casseroles and pity from the church congregation. She had a documented historical precedent for medical manipulation. She possessed the capacity to invent an illness and leverage it for personal gain. 23 years later, she was simply upgrading her tactic from pediatric sedatives to a federal conservatorship. I closed the folder. I did not feel the crushing weight of betrayal. That emotion requires a fundamental belief that the perpetrators are capable of operating with integrity. The data confirmed they were not. The auditor protocol assumed total control of my nervous system. I analyzed the threat matrix. They had the forged documents. They had a corrupt notary. They had a coordinated narrative. If I engaged in a screaming match or attempted to physically evict them into the storm, they would use my hostility as further evidence of my supposed mental instability. I needed to neutralize the legal weapon by making them voluntarily surrender it. I had to let them believe they had won the initial negotiation. I slid the manila folder back into the protective plastic sleeve. I moved silently down the hallway, returning to the guest quarters. I executed the lock bypass with the same surgical precision. The rhythmic breathing from the beds remained undisturbed. I placed the folder back beneath the false bottom of the suitcase, zipping the nylon cover into its exact previous position. I returned to my chair near the stove. The red digital readout on the weather radio shifted from 415 to 500. The acoustic signature of the storm outside began to alter. The deafening roar of the wind dropped in pitch, settling into a steady, manageable hum. The severe whiteout conditions were fracturing. By dawn, the heavy snowfall ceased entirely, leaving a blindingly bright, pristine landscape under a pale winter sun. At 7:00, the deep rumble of municipal machinery vibrated through the floorboards. The Alaskan Highway Department plows were clearing the main artery at the base of the mountain road. The geographic trap was opening. I stood in the kitchen watching the coffee brew. Sharon and Megan emerged from the hallway 30 minutes later. They looked exhausted, their faces drawn tight with the stress of the prolonged isolation. They walked to the dining table expecting another day of hostile silence and rigid boundaries. I turned around holding the glass carafe. I let my shoulders slump, altering my posture to project physical and emotional fatigue. I allowed a long, slow exhalation to escape my lungs. I looked at Megan, and then at my mother. "I am tired," I said, my voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I am tired of fighting this phantom war. You win." Sharon froze. Her hand hovered halfway to her coffee mug. She exchanged a rapid, calculating glance with Megan. The sudden shift in my defense perimeter disrupted their script. "I will sign the authorization for Sophia's educational portfolio." I continued placing the carafe on the granite counter. "I will facilitate the transfer of the $60,000. We just need to execute the paperwork properly." The tension evacuated the room so fast, it felt like a pressure valve releasing. Megan's rigid posture collapsed. She let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a sob of pure relief. Sharon smiled. It was the same triumphant, satisfied expression she wore when the pediatrician handed her that sedative prescription 13 years ago. She believed her physical presence and relentless pressure had successfully broken my resistance. "Oh, Clara," Sharon cooed, stepping forward to touch my arm, a gesture I smoothly evaded by reaching for a ceramic mug. "I knew you would finally see reason. We just want what is best for family." I stared into the black liquid in my cup. The forged conservatorship papers were sitting 50 feet away, hidden in a suitcase. They assumed my compliance erased their need to deploy the primary contingency. They did not realize that by agreeing to the extortion, I was actively guiding them off the isolated mountain and directing them straight into a snare designed to strip away everything they valued. The atmosphere inside the cabin transitioned from a hostile siege to a grotesque celebration. The moment I offered my verbal compliance, my mother and sister shed their defensive posture. The nervous pacing stopped. Megan's constant cuticle chewing ceased. Sharon began humming a cheerful off-key melody while wiping down the kitchen counter with a dishcloth. The sudden injection of domestic normalcy was far more disturbing than their previous aggression. Their cruelty relaxed into a comfortable, triumphant smugness. They believed the game was over. They believed they held the winning hand. They did not realize they were sitting at a table I constructed. I set the parameters of the surrender. I poured a second cup of coffee and addressed Megan directly. "If I am liquidating $60,000 from my primary accounts, I will not do it across a residential internet connection. The transaction requires rigorous institutional oversight. We are going to drive down to my branch in downtown Juneau. We will execute the wire transfer in the presence of a bank manager and an Alaskan notary. If the IRS flags an interstate cash dispersal of this magnitude, I need the compliance paperwork certified on camera." Megan nodded eagerly. The demand for a verified notary did not deter her. Her desperation for the cash blinded her to the legal implications of conducting fraudulent business inside a federally insured institution. "That is perfectly fine, Clara," she agreed, tapping her polished fingernails against the granite island. "We want everything documented properly, whatever makes you comfortable executing the release." I told them to pack their belongings. I required 30 minutes to clear the accumulated snow and ice from the heavy-duty rental SUV they had parked near my wood rack. I pulled on my insulated parka, grabbed a heavy wide-blade shovel, and stepped out into the blinding Alaskan morning. The air was razor-sharp, carrying the brittle clarity that follows a massive blizzard. I did not immediately approach the vehicle. I walked to the far side of my property, standing beneath the towering pine trees where the structural interference of the cabin could not block a transmission signal. I pulled a ruggedized satellite communicator from my deep pocket. Standard cellular service was still offline due to the storm, but my satellite uplink connected directly to low Earth orbit hardware. I established an encrypted data tunnel. I opened a direct communication channel to Julian. Julian is the retained estate lawyer for my private equity firm. He operates out of a high-rise office in Seattle, but he maintains deep roots and aggressive legal connections across the Pacific Northwest. He is a man who speaks entirely in billable hours and federal statutes. He does not practice family law. He practices financial warfare. I transmitted the digital photographs I had taken of the forged medical power of attorney and the backdated petition for conservatorship. I attached the complete packet sniffer telemetry logs detailing the rogue Raspberry Pi hardware Todd had planted. I included the routing data, proving the intercepted information was bridging directly to Megan's residential internet protocol address in Pennsylvania. I typed a concise summary of the tactical situation outlining their intent to execute the fraudulent wire transfer at my Juneau credit union. The satellite uplink confirmed the data transmission was successful, Julian replied 3 minutes later. His message was devoid of emotional reaction. It contained only 3 sentences. Receipt confirmed. The notary seal on the medical document constitutes felony interstate fraud. Give me 48 hours to coordinate the jurisdictional filings with the Federal Bureau before you walk them into the bank. I spent the next 2 days as controlling the operational tempo. I blamed the municipal road clearing schedule, claiming the deep snowpack on the mountain pass was impassable for civilian vehicles. I kept Sharon and Megan confined to the cabin, allowing the tension of their impending foreclosure back east to simmer just beneath their confident facades. I used the 48-hour delay to let Julian work. While my mother baked muffins in my kitchen and my sister watched daytime television, Julian was dismantling their lives. He presented the digital evidence of the network breach and the forged legal documents to his contacts within the FBI wire fraud division. Because the crime crossed state lines bridging Pennsylvania and Alaska, it immediately triggered federal jurisdiction. Julian orchestrated a synchronized legal response, ensuring the snare was tightly woven across both coasts before we ever left the mountain. On Thursday morning, the Alaskan Highway Department officially opened the pass. I announced it was time to finalize the transaction. We climbed into the heavy rental SUV. Megan took the driver's seat, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled anticipation. Sharon sat in the passenger seat, adjusting her wool scarf. I sat in the back, resting my head against the cold, tinted glass. The drive down the mountain was slow, treacherous, and saturated with dramatic irony. The heavy tires crunched over the packed ice, navigating the steep switchbacks. Sharon, feeling victorious and expansive, decided to use the captive environment to deliver a maternal lecture. "You know, Clara, this is really a turning point for us," Sharon said, turning her head slightly to project her voice into the back seat. "I know you think I am being harsh, but someone has to look out for your best interests. You have been isolated up here for so long, making all these high-stress financial decisions on your own. It is not healthy. Once this is all settled, I'm going to talk to some financial planners back home. We can start taking over some of your portfolio management just to protect you, of course. Ease your burden." She smiled warmly at the rearview mirror. She was actively confessing her intent to hijack my entire net worth, framing the theft as an act of maternal grace. She believed she was lecturing a defeated child. She did not know she was confessing to a woman who had already handed her federal indictment paperwork to a ruthless attorney. I listened to her arrogant monologue, feeling a deep, cold satisfaction settling into my bones. The trap was locked. They were driving the vehicle straight into the jaws. "I appreciate your concern, Mom," I replied, my voice perfectly smooth. "I am sure we will finalize exactly who manages my finances very soon." We reached the base of the mountain and merged onto the cleared municipal highway heading toward the downtown district. The jagged, snow-capped peaks framed the city of Juneau against a pale blue sky. Megan navigated the heavy vehicle into the plowed parking lot of the Federal Credit Union. The building was a modern structure of steel and reinforced glass, designed to project stability and institutional power. Megan killed the engine. She grabbed the faux leather binder containing the fake educational portfolio and the fraudulent transfer authorization. She gripped the binder so tightly the plastic cover buckled under her thumbs. "Let us get this done," Megan said, her voice vibrating with raw, unfiltered greed. We exited the vehicle, stepping onto the salted pavement. I walked behind them, matching their hurried, eager pace. The automatic glass doors of the Federal Credit Union slid open with a quiet, mechanical hum, welcoming the predators into the sterile, brightly lit lobby. The interior of the Federal Credit Union offered a stark contrast to the chaotic Alaskan winter we had just navigated. The lobby was a cathedral of financial stability. The floors were polished white marble, reflecting the recessed overhead lighting. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and filtered ozone. Tellers stood behind thick panels of bullet-resistant glass, executing transactions with quiet efficiency. The ambient acoustic signature was a low, soothing hum of commerce and order. It was an environment designed to intimidate amateur fraudsters. Megan walked with a rigid, hurried cadence, her boots clicking sharply against the stone tiles. She gripped the faux leather educational portfolio against her chest, shielding it like a fragile artifact. Sharon matched her pace, adjusting her scarf, projecting the unearned confidence of a woman who believed she owned every room she entered. I trailed a few steps behind them, letting them lead the procession. A junior associate greeted us near the teller line and escorted us down a short, carpeted corridor. He opened a heavy oak door, revealing the branch manager's private office. Robert Evans sat behind a wide mahogany desk. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a tailored navy suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He possessed the refined, neutral demeanor required to manage high-net-worth client portfolios. He also possessed a detailed email from Julian containing every piece of encrypted evidence I had harvested from the mountain. Evans was fully briefed. He knew exactly who was sitting in his office, and he knew exactly what they intended to do. "Please have a seat, ladies," Evans offered, gesturing toward the 3 leather chairs positioned opposite his desk. I took the chair on the far left edge of the arrangement. Sharon and Megan claimed the center seats, positioning themselves as the primary negotiators. Megan did not wait for introductory pleasantries. The crushing weight of her impending foreclosure overrode any instinct for polite protocol. She leaned forward and slid the faux leather binder across the polished mahogany wood. "We are here to authorize a wire dispersal from my sister's primary checking account," Megan stated. Her voice was tight, brittle at the edges. "The beneficiary details and the routing numbers are listed on the second page. We need the funds expedited today." Evans did not rush. He picked up his reading glasses, unfolding the wire frames with deliberate slowness. He opened the binder. The silence in the office stretched, expanding the tension in the room. A grandfather clock ticked on the wall. The second hand swept across the brass dial, echoing like a metronome. I watched a single bead of sweat trace a path down the side of Megan's neck. "I see the request is for $60,000. Evans began, his tone a perfect modulation of bureaucratic curiosity. "The memo line indicates an educational preparatory program. However, the destination routing number corresponds to a standard personal checking account held at a regional bank in Pennsylvania." "That is correct," Megan said, offering a stiff, unnatural smile. "I am the maternal guardian. I will be managing the vendor disbursements for her tutors and her travel itinerary." Evans flipped to the next page. "Standard institutional protocol for a sum of this magnitude requires a verified invoice from the educational vendor. Can you provide the tax identification number for the preparatory academy, or perhaps a syllabus confirming the accreditation of these independent tutors?" The questions were standard anti-money laundering inquiries. They were also the exact questions Megan could never answer. Her smile faltered. The corners of her mouth twitched. "I do not have those documents with me," she stammered, shifting her weight in the leather chair. "The program is exclusive. They require liquid capital up front to secure her enrollment slot. My sister already approved the transfer. The authorization form is right there." She pointed a trembling finger at the paperwork. Evans merely adjusted his glasses, looking over the rim at her. "An internal authorization does not waive our federal compliance obligations, ma'am," Evans replied smoothly. "Dispersing a large sum of liquid cash across state lines into an unverified personal account flags multiple risk indicators without proper vendor documentation. I cannot process this request." The facade shattered. The sophisticated millennial marketing vocabulary Megan had used in her fake email vanished. The terror of Todd's private loan sharks and the looming sheriff sale clawed its way to the surface. She stood up. Her chair scraped harshly against the carpet. "You are a bank manager," she snapped, her voice climbing into a shrill, erratic register. "Your job is to move the money when the account holder tells you to move it. We flew across the entire country through a blizzard to get this done. You are overstepping your authority. Process the wire right now." She gestured wildly, her hands cutting through the air. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. I sat perfectly still, observing the irony unfolding in real time. Megan had traveled to Alaska intending to frame me as an unstable, erratic individual incapable of managing my own affairs. Yet sitting in a quiet professional environment, under minimal administrative pressure, she was the one exhibiting the exact diagnostic symptoms of an unhinged psychological breakdown. Evans closed the faux leather binder. He rested his hands flat on the mahogany desk. "I am formally declining this transaction due to systemic compliance irregularities," he stated. "The funds will remain secured." Megan opened her mouth to scream, but Sharon raised a hand, silencing her oldest daughter with a sharp, calculated glare. Sharon understood that Megan's emotional meltdown was a tactical failure. It was time to deploy the heavy artillery. "Sit down, Megan," Sharon ordered, her tone cold and authoritative. Sharon reached into her oversized designer tote bag. She did not produce another colorful brochure. She pulled out the thick manila folder I had photographed beneath the false bottom of her suitcase at 3 o'clock in the morning. She placed it onto the center of the desk with a resounding slap. "I apologize for my daughter's frustration, Mr. Evans." Sharon began executing a flawless pivot into tragic maternal sorrow. "We were hoping to handle this quietly to preserve my youngest daughter's dignity, but since you require further documentation, you leave me no choice." She opened the folder, rotating the documents so the text faced the branch manager. "My daughter Clara is suffering from a severe unmedicated mental health crisis," Sharon explained, lowering her voice to a dramatic, confidential whisper. "She has isolated herself in a remote cabin. She is exhibiting extreme paranoia and erratic behavioral patterns. She is entirely unfit to manage her financial portfolio." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the bright blue certification stamp on the final page. "This is a medical power of attorney and a petition for emergency conservatorship," Sharon declared. "It is legally notarized. As her mother, I am executing my right to assume total custodial guardianship over her estate. I am overriding her accounts. You will grant me unrestricted access to her routing numbers immediately so I can secure her assets before she destroys herself." Sharon leaned back, crossing her arms. She wore a look of supreme vindication. She had played the ultimate trump card. She believed she had bypassed the banking protocols by legally stripping me of my autonomy. She thought the blue ink of a corrupt Pennsylvania notary was a skeleton key to my vault. I looked at the forged medical document resting on the polished wood. I did not speak. I did not defend my sanity. I simply watched Robert Evans. The branch manager looked down at the petition for emergency conservatorship. He studied the backdated signature block. He did not appear surprised or intimidated by the sudden escalation. He slowly lifted his gaze, shifting his attention past Sharon and Megan, focusing on the frosted glass door located on the left side of his office. The heavy brass handle on the frosted glass turned with a sharp metallic click. The door swung open. Julian stepped into the room. My estate lawyer wore a tailored charcoal wool suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He radiated the cold, predatory energy of a man who dismantles corporate entities for a living. Tucked under his right arm was a thick red legal binder bursting with federal evidentiary filings. He was not alone. Stepping through the doorway behind him, filling the confined space of the office with the heavy sound of utility belts and tactical boots, were 2 uniformed officers from the Juneau Police Department. The presence of uniformed law enforcement instantly altered the atmospheric pressure inside the branch manager's office. The 2 Juneau police officers stepped inside, positioning themselves in front of the closed oak door, blocking the only exit. Their duty belts creaked a heavy utilitarian sound that cut through the polished silence of the credit union. Megan stopped breathing. Her chest froze mid-inhalation. Sharon remained seated, but her spine stiffened, pressing rigid against the leather chair back. She looked at the officers and then shifted her gaze to the silver-haired man holding the red legal binder. "What is the meaning of this?" Sharon demanded, attempting to project her usual suburban authority. "We are conducting confidential family business. You have no right to interrupt us." Julian did not offer a polite smile. He walked to the edge of the mahogany desk, placing his red binder next to the forged manila folder. "My name is Julian Croft," he stated. His voice carried the precise, unyielding cadence of a judge delivering a sentence. "I am a retained legal counsel for Clara Morgan. I represent her financial estate and her personal holdings." He reached out and tapped his index finger against the bright blue notary stamp on the petition for emergency conservatorship. "You are not conducting family business," Julian corrected. "You are attempting to utter a forged legal instrument across state lines in a federally insured banking institution. That constitutes a Class B felony." Sharon flinched. The legal terminology landed like a physical blow. She scrambled to recover her footing, pointing a trembling finger toward my chair. "She is unwell," Sharon insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "The paperwork is legitimate. We had a licensed professional certify her condition. Look at her sitting there showing zero emotion while armed police interrupt her family. She is detached from reality. We are just trying to secure her assets before she ruins her own life." I remained perfectly still. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not defend myself because a data architect knows you never interrupt your opponent when they are actively handing you the victory. Julian opened his red binder. He ignored Sharon's theatrical performance entirely. He extracted a stack of printed server logs. These were the telemetry reports I had harvested from the digital sandbox back at the cabin. 3 days ago, your husband Gregory breached my client's residential property, Julian said, directing his attention solely to Megan. He installed a rogue network packet sniffer disguised as a charging block. He configured the hardware to intercept wireless communications and route the stolen data directly to your residential internet protocol address in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. We have the digital fingerprint. We possess the timestamp transmission logs. Megan's skin lost all remaining color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. She shrank back into the expensive leather upholstery. Cyber intrusion and attempted data theft carry significant federal penalties. Julian continued flipping to the next page in his binder. However, the network breach is merely a secondary concern today. The primary investigation centers on the specific numeric value you demanded from my client, $60,000. I watched Julian analyze a fresh document. Up until this exact second, I believed I understood the fundamental mathematics of their extortion. I had viewed the county civil court filings. I knew they were 90 days in arrears on their mortgage. I assumed the $60,000 was the necessary capital to cure their default and halt the impending sheriff's sale. I was wrong. The data I possessed was accurate, but it was incomplete. Julian was about to supply the missing variables. You constructed a narrative regarding an elite educational preparatory program for your daughter. Sophia, Julian stated. My client initially deduced this was a fabricated shell designed to secure funds to halt your residential foreclosure. That was a logical conclusion, but it underestimated the depth of your fiduciary malfeasance. Julian extracted a bank statement bearing the logo of a separate wealth management firm. He placed it on the desk next to the server logs. 12 years ago, Sophia's biological father passed away. Julian explained. Prior to his death, he established a survivor trust account to ensure his daughter's future. The initial principal deposit was $150,000. The custodial parameters dictated the funds were strictly preserved for educational or medical necessities until the beneficiary reached the age of 18. The grandfather clock ticked against the quiet wall. Megan closed her eyes, refusing to look at the document on the desk. Julian pressed forward, dismantling her life with surgical precision. As the maternal guardian, you possessed custodial oversight. Over the past 48 months, you and your husband systematically drained that trust. You forged the minor's signature. You fabricated ghost educational expenses. You engaged in continuous embezzlement to cover your husband's catastrophic day trading losses. A sharp, cold realization washed over me. Todd had mentioned the violent interest rates of private loan sharks while sweating in my mudroom. He was not talking about a standard bank mortgage. Your husband ran out of institutional credit 18 months ago, Julian said, confirming my internal hypothesis. He sought alternative liquidity from unbanked private creditors. Those individuals do not file civil foreclosure notices when a debt goes unpaid. They send collectors. Julian leaned over the desk, forcing Megan to open her eyes and face him. The $60,000 you demanded from Clara was not intended to save your house, Julian clarified. The bank is going to take your house regardless. The money was intended to pay off Todd's dangerous private creditors and provide a temporary cash infusion to artificially inflate the depleted trust account. Julian delivered the final crushing blow. Sophia turns 18 in 6 months. Under Pennsylvania state law, a survivor trust requires a mandatory statutory audit upon the beneficiary reaching the age of majority. If the federal examiners open that ledger and find a zero balance, you and Gregory will face consecutive prison sentences for custodial fraud and embezzlement against a minor. You were not trying to steal from Clara to live comfortably. You were stealing from Clara to cover up the fact that you already robbed your own child. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. Silence that followed this. The intricate layers of their deception lay exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the branch manager's office. Megan was not a desperate homeowner. She was a predator who had cannibalized her own daughter's inheritance. Sharon sat frozen, staring at her oldest daughter. The matriarch, who prided herself on controlling the family narrative, looked genuinely shocked. She had participated in the extortion scheme, believing it was a simple transfer of wealth from her estranged, wealthy daughter to her favored, struggling daughter. She did not know she had been recruited to act as an accessory to a federal embezzlement cover-up. "This is a lie," Megan whispered, her voice a thin, ragged thread. "You cannot prove any of this. You printed some fake bank statements to intimidate us." Julian checked the stainless steel chronometer on his left wrist. He adjusted his cuff, smoothing the wool fabric. "Clara granted me a 48-hour operational window while you were confined to our mountain property," Julian said. "I did not spend the last 2 days drafting a polite cease and desist letter. I spent the time coordinating with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Pennsylvania State Police." Julian looked directly into Megan's terrified eyes. "Right now, at this exact minute, a joint federal and state tactical task force is executing a search and seizure warrant on your colonial property in Pottsville. They are confiscating your hard drives, your banking ledgers, and your husband's mobile devices. They have already secured Gregory in handcuffs. The evidence of your embezzlement is currently being cataloged by forensic accountants. The snare I had set on the frozen Alaskan mountain was just the visible trigger. The actual trap spanned 3,000 miles, snapping shut across 2 different time zones simultaneously. Megan had flown to Juneau to rob me, and she had left her entire criminal enterprise undefended back home. The psychological collapse of a predator is not a quiet event. When the illusion of control shatters, the resulting panic is visceral, raw, and devoid of any dignified restraint. Megan did not sit in quiet contemplation of her ruined scheme. The air rushed out of her lungs in a sharp, jagged gasp. She sprang upward from the leather chair, her knees knocking the heavy mahogany desk. She spun around, searching the small office for an exit that did not exist. The 2 uniformed Juneau police officers stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the frosted glass door. Megan turned her terror outward, seeking a target to absorb the impact of the federal raid. She chose the man currently wearing handcuffs 3,000 miles away. "It was his idea!" Megan shrieked, her vocal cords straining under the sudden extreme distress. "Todd lost the money. He made the bad trades. He owed the private lenders. He forged Sophia's signature on the trust withdrawals. I am just a mother trying to keep a roof over her child. I did not want to come up here. He forced me to do it." She offered her husband to the justice system with zero hesitation. It was a fascinating display of self-preservation. During my childhood, whenever Megan broke a household rule, she immediately pointed a finger at a sibling or a classmate. Accountability was a foreign concept to her. She believed if she screamed loud enough and blamed someone else, the consequences would simply evaporate. The officers did not react to her vocal performance. They operated on verifiable evidence, not emotional outbursts. The taller officer stepped forward, withdrawing a pair of steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The metallic clinking sound cut through Megan's frantic monologue. "Megan Williams, you are under arrest." The officer stated, his tone level and practiced. He reached out, grasping her left wrist, guiding her arms behind her back. "Do not touch me," she sobbed, twisting her shoulders in a futile attempt to evade the restraint. The officer applied firm downward pressure, locking the first steel bracelet over her wrist. He secured the second cuff with a sharp, definitive click. The mechanical sound echoed against the polished walls of the branch manager's office. It was the sound of a closing ledger. "You are being detained on preliminary charges of attempted wire fraud, identity theft, and uttering forged legal documents." The officer continued reciting the statutory codes. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Megan slumped forward, her designer peacoat bunching awkwardly around her confined shoulders. The fight drained out of her, leaving only the hollow reality of her situation. Sharon watched her oldest daughter receive the Miranda warning. The matriarch remained seated, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. She looked at Julian and then at the branch manager, hoping to find a sympathetic audience. She found only cold, professional detachment. Sharon attempted to construct a final defensive perimeter. "I had no knowledge of the trust fund," Sharon declared, keeping her voice steady. "I did not know Gregory took that money. I am just a concerned parent who flew here to check on her youngest daughter. I am an innocent bystander." Julian did not even look up from his red binder. He simply extended his right hand, pointing a single rigid finger at the center of the mahogany desk. Resting exactly where Sharon had slammed it 5 minutes earlier was the manila folder containing the fraudulent medical power of attorney and the backdated petition for conservatorship. "You presented a fabricated legal instrument to a federal banking official," Julian countered, his voice carrying the chill of a winter draft. "You attempted to leverage a forged medical certification to seize unauthorized control of my client's assets. Your signature is on the custodial petition. Ignorance of the underlying embezzlement does not excuse your active participation in the extortion attempt. You are an accessory to fraud." The second officer stepped forward, detaching the restraints from his belt. "Sharon Morgan, you are under arrest. My mother did not scream. She did not fight the officer. The rigid posture she had maintained for her entire adult life crumbled. The matriarch who had dictated the emotional weather of our household, who had assigned roles and demanded obedience, simply lowered her head. She allowed the officer to draw her hands behind her back. The steel cuffs locked around her wrists, binding the manicured fingers she had once used to tear my college acceptance letter in half. The officers guided them toward the door. We walked out of the manager's office, leaving Robert Evans sitting quietly behind his desk. The procession moved through the main lobby of the Federal Credit Union. The quiet hum of commerce ceased. Tellers stopped counting currency. Customers paused in the middle of their transactions. Everyone turned to watch two women in expensive winter coats being marched toward the exit by armed law enforcement. Sharon kept her chin tucked to her chest, attempting to hide her face from the public scrutiny. Megan wept openly, her tears ruining her carefully applied makeup. The automatic glass doors parted. We stepped out of the heated institutional sanctuary and into the brutal Alaskan morning. The severe whiteout blizzard had passed, but the temperature remained fixed, near zero. The air hit the lungs like swallowed glass. The sky above Juneau was a brilliant, agonizing blue, reflecting off the fresh, deep snowpack. Two municipal police cruisers idled in the salted parking lot. Their exhaust pipes expelled thick plumes of white vapor into the freezing atmosphere. The officers guided Megan toward the lead vehicle. They pressed a hand to the top of her head, easing her into the hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing her inside the cage. The second officer escorted Sharon toward the trailing vehicle. Before she reached the rear passenger door, she stopped. She dug her boots into the packed snow, refusing to move forward. She turned her head, locking her gaze onto me. I stood on the salted pavement 10 feet away. I wore my heavy insulated parka, my hands resting deep in the fleece-lined pockets. I did not gloat. I did not offer a victorious smile. I merely observed the final calculation of the audit. Sharon deployed her final remaining weapon. She summoned the profound generational guilt she had utilized for over 2 decades. Her eyes widened, filling with desperate, fearful tears. The mask of the strict matriarch was gone, replaced by the terrified plea of a cornered parent. "Clara," she cried, her voice cracking under the frigid air, "please tell them to stop. I am your mother. You cannot do this to blood." The words hung in the freezing air, forming pale white clouds of condensation before dissipating into nothing. She expected the biological tether to halt the legal machinery. She believed the title of mother carried an inherent diplomatic immunity, granting her the right to destroy her children without consequence. I looked at the woman standing beside the police cruiser. I remembered the sound of tearing cardstock. I remembered the quiet bathroom at 4 o'clock in the morning. I remembered the core doctrine she had etched into the foundation of our family. I pulled my hands from my pockets, letting them rest at my sides. My voice was calm, carrying across the cold distance with absolute clinical precision. "You taught me that this is who we are," I replied. "I am just enforcing the tradition." Sharon stared at me. The realization settled into her features, erasing the final trace of hope. She understood the transaction was closed. The ledger was balanced. The debt she had incurred by trying to break me had finally come due. The officer placed his hand on her shoulder, guiding her downward into the back seat of the cruiser. He shut the door, severing our sight line behind the tinted glass. The officers climbed into the front seats of their respective vehicles. The engines revved, shifting gears. The cruisers rolled out of the parking lot, their tires crunching heavily over the frozen asphalt. The roof-mounted light bars activated, painting the high snowbanks in rhythmic sweeping flashes of harsh red and blue. I stood in the parking lot watching the vehicles merge onto the main highway. The flashing lights shrank into the distance until they disappeared entirely around a bend in the mountain road. The silence of the Alaskan winter reclaimed the space. Julian stepped up beside me, his leather dress shoes crunching on the salt. He held his red legal binder tucked securely under his arm. The tactical execution was flawless. He noted his tone shifting from aggressive litigator to calm advisor. The local authorities will hold them in central lockup until the federal magistrate processes the extradition order to Pennsylvania. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the empty road. The immediate threat was neutralized. The predators had been caged. But a financial audit is never truly complete until the collateral damage is assessed and mitigated. "We need to return to your office, Julian," I said, turning away from the street. Julian arched an eyebrow. "The legal filings are already in motion, Clara. You should go home and rest." "I cannot go home yet," I replied, walking toward his parked sedan. "Megan and Todd are going to federal prison. Sharon is facing felony accessory charges. The state of Pennsylvania is currently standing in a foreclosed house with a 16-year-old girl who just lost her entire family and her inheritance in a single morning." I opened the passenger door of his car, looking across the roof at my attorney. "We have to build a new trust." The interior of Julian Croft's law firm occupied the top floor of a glass and steel high-rise overlooking the Juneau Harbor. It was an environment engineered to project unyielding authority. The walls were paneled in dark walnut. The carpets absorbed all ambient noise. The only sound in his private office was the steady, rhythmic ticking of a brass carriage clock resting on a bookshelf. It was the sound of order. It was the sound of a system functioning exactly as designed. I sat in a high-backed leather chair holding a porcelain cup of black tea his assistant had silently provided. The adrenaline from the credit union parking lot had entirely dissipated. In its place, a cold clinical focus anchored my posture. The chaotic noise my family had generated for the past 2 decades was finally extinguished. Now we had to process the paperwork. Julian sat behind his desk, opening his encrypted laptop. He adjusted his silver reading glasses, pulling up the real-time communications portal, linking him to the federal task force in Pennsylvania. "The initial operational reports are populating," Julian stated, his eyes scanning the digital text. "The tactical unit breached the Pottsville residence approximately 40 minutes ago. Gregory attempted to submerge a secondary laptop in a bathtub when they breached the front door. The forensic team secured the hardware. They are already extracting the deleted cache files." Julian scrolled down the screen, his expression remaining impassive. "The preliminary ledger analysis confirms your hypothesis," Julian continued. "The embezzlement was not a sudden, desperate act. It was a sustained, systemic bleed. Gregory and Megan initiated the first unauthorized withdrawal from Sophia's Survivor Trust 4 years ago. They utilized small, staggered transfers to avoid triggering automatic banking alerts. They funneled the capital through decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges, attempting to mask the final destination. The destination was the private loan syndicate Todd owed. I murmured, taking a slow sip of the hot tea. "Correct," Julian nodded. He was borrowing from unbanked entities to cover his leveraged market losses. When the margin calls hit, he drained his daughter's future to keep his own kneecaps intact. Megan facilitated the fraud by forging the custodial release forms. They face multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and embezzlement against a minor. The federal sentencing guidelines for this specific combination of offenses mandate significant mandatory minimums. They are looking at a decade behind a perimeter fence. I rested my cup on the polished wooden coaster. "And my mother, Sharon, is currently being processed at the Central Municipal Holding Facility down the street," Julian replied, shifting his gaze from the screen to my face. "The forged conservatorship petition elevates her status from a bystander to an active co-conspirator. Uttering a fraudulent legal document across state boundaries guarantees her extradition to the East Coast. She will stand trial alongside her oldest daughter." A sharp, trilling sound interrupted the quiet cadence of the office. The secure landline on Julian's desk was ringing. He glanced at the caller identification display. "It is the public defender's office operating out of the Juneau Municipal Courthouse," Julian informed me, resting his hand near the receiver. "They are formally requesting a preliminary bail hearing for Sharon and Megan. The standard procedure is to contact the nearest solvent relative to post the collateral bond." "Do you want me to route the call to voicemail?" "Answer it," I instructed. "Put the audio on the external speaker." Julian pressed a silver button on the console. A tired, raspy voice filled the room, carrying the background echo of a busy holding facility. "This is Duty Counsel Jenkins," the voice announced. "I am representing Sharon Morgan and Megan Williams. They requested I contact Clara Morgan regarding the posting of a surety bond pending their extradition hearings." The magistrate set the combined bail at $100,000. A 10% cash deposit is required to secure their temporary release. My mother and sister were sitting in a concrete cell, relying on the very person they had traveled across the continent to destroy. They still believed the biological tether would force my compliance. They assumed I would flinch at the reality of their incarceration and open my checkbook to rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. "Mr. Jenkins." "This is Clara Morgan," I replied, leaning toward the speaker. "I am the solvent relative. I want you to relay a specific message to your clients." "Go ahead." "Ms. Morgan," the public defender said, the scratching of a pen audible over the line. "Inform them that I am declining the request to post bond." I stated my vocal delivery devoid of any hesitation or pity. "I will not authorize a single dollar from my estate to secure their release. They are flight risks facing federal indictments. They will remain in municipal custody until the marshals transport them. Furthermore, inform them that my legal counsel is currently drafting permanent protective orders. Do not contact this number again." I signaled Julian. He tapped the silver button, terminating the connection. The line went dead, restoring the quiet sanctuary of the office. Julian opened a leather portfolio, retrieving a stack of freshly printed legal filings. He placed a heavy silver fountain pen beside the documents. "These are the injunctions," Julian explained, sliding the papers across the desk. "They establish a permanent 500-mile buffer zone around your physical residence, your place of employment, and any digital communication architecture you control. Once the judge signs these tomorrow morning, any attempt by your family to contact you via phone, email, or third-party proxy constitutes an immediate violation of parole and a separate criminal offense." I picked up the heavy fountain pen. I unscrewed the cap, feeling the textured grip against my fingers. For 23 years, my signature had been a vulnerability. Megan had forged it to try and steal my property. Sharon had demanded it to strip my autonomy. Now I was utilizing my own name to build an impenetrable fortress. I signed the first page, pressing the dark ink firmly into the thick paper stock. I signed the second. I signed the third. As I executed the final signature, a profound sense of symmetry settled into my conscious mind. The poetic justice of the situation was a flawless mathematical equation. Sharon had carried a fraudulent medical power of attorney into that bank. Her explicit goal was to convince a legal authority that I was incapable of governing my own existence. She wanted to lock me in a psychiatric facility where my schedule, my diet, and my finances were entirely dictated by an external warden. Instead, the snare reversed the trajectory. Sharon was the one sitting in a holding cell. She had been fingerprinted and photographed. Her expensive wool coat and her cheap floral perfume had been confiscated and replaced by a standardized, state-issued uniform. The municipal guards now determined when she slept, when she ate, and when she was allowed to speak. By attempting to legally erase my autonomy, she had permanently forfeited her own freedom. The universe possessed a dark, elegant humor. I handed the executed injunctions back to Julian. He reviewed the signatures, blotting the wet ink before sealing them inside a specialized courier envelope. "The primary threats are neutralized," Xavier Julian said, leaning back in his chair. "The ledgers are balanced. You secured your perimeter. You can return to your mountain and resume your life." I looked past him, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window. The sun was beginning its low arc across the Alaskan horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the frozen harbor. The sky was clear, unblemished by incoming storms. Julian was technically correct. The immediate hostiles were caged. The financial hemorrhage was stopped. The structural integrity of my existence was intact. However, an audit requires examining every column on the spreadsheet. You cannot close a file if a significant variable remains unresolved. I replayed the timeline of the federal raid in my mind. The tactical unit breached the Pottsville home. They arrested Todd. They seized the electronics. They verified the empty survivor trust. There was a glaring omission in the operational report. Julian, I began turning my attention back to the desk. When the federal agents executed the warrant at Megan's house, who else was on the premises? Julian frowned, opening his laptop to check the unredacted field notes. He scrolled through the tactical summary. The entry team cleared the primary structure. Gregory was the only adult present. And the minor, I pressed. Julian tapped the screen. The 16-year-old female was located in the detached garage. She was reportedly working on a dismantled engine block when the agents arrived. Child Protective Services was dispatched to the scene. Since both legal guardians are now facing federal detention, the minor was remanded into temporary state custody, pending a familial placement hearing. The ticking of the brass carriage clock suddenly felt uncomfortably loud. The adult predators were handled, but the blast radius of their greed had leveled the ground around them. Sophia was a 16-year-old girl who wanted to be an aviation mechanic. She had spent the morning turning wrenches in her garage, only to watch armed agents drag her father away in handcuffs. She had just discovered her mother had abandoned her to fly to Alaska. She was about to learn her parents had stolen her entire inheritance, leaving her destitute. She was the innocent casualty caught in the crossfire of a generational curse. My mother and sister had attempted to destroy my future when I was 18. Now they had successfully vaporized Sophia's future before she even reached the age of majority. I stood up from the leather chair. The cold, analytical detachment that had carried me through the blizzard, the extortion and the bank lobby shifted. It evolved into a sharp-focused resolve. I cannot go back to the mountain yet, I told my attorney. Julian closed his laptop, narrowing his eyes. The criminal proceedings are out of our jurisdiction, Clara. The state will handle the child's placement. You have no legal obligation to intervene. I am aware of my obligations, Julian. I walked toward the heavy oak door. My family tradition dictates that the women stay home, surrender their potential, and let the cycle repeat. My mother tore my college letter to enforce that rule. Megan stole her own daughter's trust fund to maintain the illusion of success. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob, looking back at the silver-haired lawyer. I broke the tradition when I walked out of that house 5 years ago, I stated. I am not going to let them drag that girl down with them. Draft the necessary petitions, Julian. We are establishing a new trust. The drive back up the mountain pass required a deliberate reduction in speed. I navigated my reinforced truck through the steep ascending switchbacks, leaving the municipal grid of downtown Juneau far below. The sky bruised into a deep, bruised violet as the afternoon sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The snowplows had carved sheer white canyons on either side of the asphalt, creating a pristine corridor of packed ice and gravel. With every 100 feet of elevation gained the residue of the Federal Credit Union, the holding cells, and the chaotic legal skirmish stripped away from my consciousness. I turned onto my private access road. The heavy steel gate rolled open at my digital command. The tires crunched over the fresh powder, bringing me to the cleared staging area near the covered wood rack. The heavy-duty rental SUV that brought the intruders to my doorstep was gone. It had been impounded by the rental agency following the arrests. The property was empty. The visual silence of the exterior was profound. I unlocked the front entrance, pushing the heavy, solid core door inward. Ghost stood waiting on the rubber of the mudroom. The Malamute did not whine or pace. He offered a low, resonant rumble deep in his chest, pressing his heavy shoulder against my knee. I ran my gloved hand through his thick gray fur, feeling the solid heat of a creature that operated entirely on loyalty and instinct. He knew the hostile elements had been removed. I removed my insulated parka and my boots, stepping onto the hardwood flooring of the main living space. The ambient temperature was a regulated 68 degrees, but the psychological climate inside the structure felt contaminated. A house absorbs the energetic signature of its occupants. For 3 days, my sanctuary had been occupied by predators. I walked directly to the guest quarters at the end of the hallway. I pushed the door open. The air inside the room was stagnant heavy with the lingering synthetic chemical trace of Sharon's floral perfume. It was the olfactory signature of my childhood trauma suspended in the heating currents. I did not reach for a mild air freshener. I unlatched the reinforced window frame and pushed the triple-paned glass wide open. The sub-zero Alaskan wind shrieked into the room carrying the scent of frozen pine and raw earth. The icy draft scoured the walls violently, displacing the toxic artificial fragrance. I approached the secondary bed where my mother had slept. I stripped the linens, pulling the fitted sheets, the heavy quilts, and the pillowcases into a tight bundle. I carried the fabric directly out the back door and deposited the entire load into the steel incinerator bin positioned near the generator shed. I would not wash them. I would burn them. Returning to the guest bathroom, I conducted a forensic sweep of the surfaces. Narcissistic individuals possess a subconscious compulsion to mark their territory. They leave small, inexpensive artifacts behind to ensure their presence lingers long after their physical departure. Resting on the edge of the porcelain sink was a collection of cheap hotel soaps and miniature lotion bottles Sharon had pilfered during her airport layover. The items possessed zero monetary value. Their only purpose was to serve as visual anchors, forcing me to remember she had invaded my private perimeter. I swept the plastic bottles and wrapped soaps into a trash receptacle. I retrieved a canister of industrial bleach from the utility closet. I saturated a heavy cloth with the harsh chemical and meticulously wiped down the vanity, the mirror, the door handles, and the light switches. I scrubbed the geometry of the room until the faint ghost of their occupation was entirely eradicated by the sterile biting scent of the cleaning agent. The physical purge was necessary, but my profession required a more rigorous standard of security. The biological threat was caged in a municipal holding facility. I needed absolute confirmation that the digital threat was equally neutralized. I walked into the mudroom and crouched near the baseboard outlet. The rogue Raspberry Pi device remained plugged into the electrical socket, still attempting to bridge a connection to a Pennsylvania router that was currently sitting in an FBI evidence locker. I pulled the small white plastic square from the wall. I carried the espionage hardware into my garage, placing it flat on the concrete floor. I retrieved a heavy ball-peen hammer from my steel workbench. I brought the iron head down onto the plastic casing with a sharp, calculated strike. The fiberglass motherboard splintered with a satisfying crunch. I struck it a second time, shattering the silicon chips and severing the internal antennae. I swept the crushed technological debris into a dustpan, discarding it into the refuse bin. I moved to my restricted server room, locking the door behind me. I settled into the ergonomic chair facing my bank of glowing monitors. My fingers engaged the mechanical keyboard, initiating a comprehensive diagnostic sweep of my localized network. I dissolved the quarantine sandbox I had constructed to trap the initial intrusion. I purged the synthetic files and the dummy financial ledgers, deleting the encrypted gigabytes of useless data Megan had spent 3 days trying to crack. I executed a deep packet inspection across every port and routing channel, searching for dormant malware or secondary localized bugs. The code cascaded down the vertical screens in rapid streams of green text. The terminal parsed millions of data points, validating the integrity of my firewalls. The diagnostic bar reached 100%. The final output rendered on the central monitor confirming 0 anomalies, 0 breaches, and 0 unauthorized nodes. My digital perimeter was ironclad. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server cooling fans. The tension that had coiled in my upper spine since the moment Megan's first text message arrived finally unspooled. I stood up, leaving the glowing screens, and walked through the kitchen, stepping out onto the expansive back deck. The Alaskan landscape stretched out before me in a panoramic display of brutal, flawless beauty. The towering pine trees held thick shelves of fresh snow on their heavy branches. The sky was an infinite canvas of darkening blue speckled with the early silver light of emerging stars. The sub-zero air filled my lungs, forcing my respiratory system to operate with crisp, sharp efficiency. I rested my hands on the frozen cedar railing. For 5 years I had operated under a fundamental misconception regarding my own geography. when I taped that torn acceptance letter back together and boarded a plane to the furthest edge of the continent, I believed I was running away. I believed I was seeking a remote corner of the map to hide from the relentless emotional extortion of my family. I looked at the heavy steel deadbolts on my doors. I looked at the solar arrays charging on the reinforced roof. I looked at the blinking green lights of the global financial servers operating securely inside the timber frame. I did not run away to a hiding place. I spent 5 years constructing a citadel. A hiding place is built out of fear. A hiding place requires the occupant to remain silent and small, hoping the predator walks past the door. A fortress is built out of strength. It is designed to withstand a siege. It is engineered to break the enemy upon its walls. My mother and sister had traveled 3,000 miles to test the structural integrity of my life. They brought their practiced manipulation, their forged documents, and their desperate greed. The fortress did not yield. The defensive architecture functioned flawlessly, grinding their extortion scheme into federal indictments and shattered illusions. The emotional residue of 20 years of psychological abuse evaporated into the cold atmospheric pressure. The phantom guilt, the programmed obligation, and the lingering shadow of the Pennsylvania row house dissolved entirely. I was no longer the quiet teenager absorbing their cruelty. I was the architect of my own sovereign territory. I turned away from the vast frozen horizon and walked back inside the warm, well-lit cabin. Ghost followed me into the server room, resting his heavy chin on my thigh as I sat back down at the central terminal. The defensive protocols were concluded. The threat was mitigated. But a successful audit requires reallocating the recovered assets to ensure maximum future yield. The destruction of my sister and my mother was merely the inevitable consequence of their own mathematics. The true victory required securing the one variable they had attempted to destroy. I adjusted my posture, aligning my wrists over the keyboard. I bypassed the standard commercial routing interfaces, opening a highly secure direct portal to my primary wealth management firm in Seattle. I bypassed the standard encrypted layers, utilizing a biometric verification scan to unlock my foundational capital reserves. The cursor blinked steadily against the dark screen, awaiting my command. I was preparing to execute a final, deeply personal financial transaction. I was preparing to leverage the immense weight of my Alaskan fortress to project a shield across the continent, entirely reshaping the trajectory of a girl sitting in a freezing garage 3,000 miles away. 6 months later, the calendar shifted into late July. The Alaskan permafrost retreated, exposing dark, jagged granite and resilient alpine timber. The frozen isolation thawed, allowing the external world to resume its natural biological rhythm. The blinding whiteouts were replaced by endless stretches of pale blue daylight that lingered well past midnight. The landscape revealed its true foundation, hard, unyielding, and permanent. In Pennsylvania, the federal justice system operated with the same relentless geological pressure, grinding down the fragile facades my family had constructed. The legal updates arrived via encrypted email carrying the clinical detachment of official court reporters. Gregory accepted a plea agreement early in the discovery phase. He traded a fraction of his sentence for full cooperation against the private, unbanked syndicate that funded his margin accounts. Megan refused the initial prosecutorial deal. She gambled on a sympathetic jury, hoping her tears would manipulate the federal courtroom the way they manipulated our childhood. She lost the wager. She currently resides in a minimum security federal correctional institution, awaiting her final sentencing hearing. Sharon remains incarcerated in a state holding facility pending her accessory trial. Her attempts to manage the prison's psychological staff yielded zero dividends. Wardens do not care about manufactured panic attacks or fake medical emergencies. They only care about head counts and schedule compliance. The matriarch, who demanded total obedience from her daughters, is now dictated by the harsh ringing of cell block bells. Sophia did not become a ward of the state. The family court processed the custodial transfer with surprising efficiency, placing her with her paternal aunt. This woman was a quiet retired postal worker who drove a reliable sedan and maintained a zero balance on her credit cards. She offered the one specific resource my sister and mother despised: predictable, boring stability. I sat in my server room, the cooling fans humming a low, steady bass line. I opened the bypass tray on my commercial laser printer. I did not load standard recycled office sheets. I inserted a stack of pure archival woven cotton bond paper. It is the grade of material utilized for historical records and federal treaties. It possesses a distinct heavy texture. The woven fibers lock together, forming a matrix of exceptional tensile strength. If a person attempts to rip this material with their bare hands, the paper will slice their skin before it yields. I initiated the print sequence. The warm sheets slid into the output tray bearing the complex legal parameters of an irrevocable educational trust. I drafted the financial architecture myself, and Julian certified the federal statutes. The vehicle contained $150,000. It was the exact sum her father originally deposited restored, with an additional 5 years of compound market interest. The operational clauses were ironclad and merciless. No blood relative could petition for proxy control. No guardian could request liquid disbursements for independent tutors or travel expenses. The capital was locked behind a biometric escrow authorized solely to route tuition payments directly to the National Aviation Mechanic Academy Sophia had selected. I picked up the thick, warm pages, aligning the edges on my steel desk. Sharon could never tear this document in half. Megan could never siphon its value to cover a bad debt. It was a mathematical fortress built out of verified routing numbers and federal tax codes designed to protect a single teenage girl. I unscrewed my silver fountain pen and executed my signature across the bottom margin, sealing the vault. The scene transitioned from the sterile daylight of the server room to the rich amber glow of a late Alaskan evening. The cast-iron stove in the center of the living space radiated a deep, penetrating heat, pushing back against the chill of the descending dusk. The cedar walls absorbed the warmth, smelling of wood smoke and cured timber. I stood in the kitchen, retrieving 3 heavy crystal tumblers from the upper cabinet. The heavy front door opened. Julian Croft stepped into the mudroom, kicking his boots against the rubber matting. He did not wear his tailored charcoal courtroom suit. He wore a heavy wool sweater and rugged denim. He did not carry a red legal binder bursting with federal indictments. He carried a sealed bottle of aged Kentucky straight bourbon. The silver-haired attorney visited twice a year, not to bill hours or discuss corporate litigation, but to verify the structural integrity of the life we had defended. I placed the crystal glasses on the granite island. He uncorked the bottle, pouring the dark amber liquid. The sound of the glass clinking carried a rhythm of quiet, unspoken celebration. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sophia walked into the main living space. She had flown up from the lower 48 2 days prior using a commercial airline ticket I purchased directly through a secure travel portal. We met at the Juneau terminal without tears or dramatic embraces. We simply collected our luggage and drove up the mountain. She did not inherit her mother's nervous, erratic energy. She moved with the grounded, purposeful stride of someone who understood how physical mechanisms operated. She wore faded denim and a gray hooded sweatshirt. A faint permanent crescent of dark engine grease stained the cuticle of her left thumb. She smelled of aviation fuel, cold wind, and actual physical labor. Ghost lifted his heavy head from the woven rug near the stove. The Malamute, who had growled a lethal warning at Gregory and stared down my mother without blinking, offered a soft, welcoming chuff. Sophia dropped to her knees on the floorboards, burying her hands deep into the thick gray fur around the dog's neck. Ghost leaned his considerable weight into her shoulder, permitting the affection. Sophia laughed. The sound was clear, unburdened, and free of the calculating manipulation that had infected our bloodline for decades. It was the sound of a child who knew her baseline survival was no longer tied to the chaotic whims of a toxic household. I stood beside the kitchen island, holding the crystal tumbler. I watched my niece wrestle with the northern wolf dog in the firelight. Julian stood next to me, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the bourbon, observing the exact same tableau. We did not need to discuss the ruined colonial house in Pottsville or the federal holding cells. Those elements were archived, closed files. I looked at Sophia and realized the fundamental architecture of our family had finally shifted. The old tradition demanded that the eldest daughters stay home. It demanded we shrink our ambitions to fit inside the narrow boundaries of a husband's financial failure or a mother's fragile, demanding ego. It required us to tape our broken futures together in dark bathrooms and endure the silence. That lineage was dead. It burned in the steel incinerator out back alongside the cheap hotel soaps and the synthetic floral perfume. The girl laughing on the rug would never have to negotiate for her own potential. She would graduate from her academy. She would rebuild turbine engines. She would dictate her own altitude. The women in this bloodline no longer stay home and surrender. We build, we audit, we survive. We inherit far more than eye-color antique furniture or the physical structure of the houses we grow up in. Long before we are old enough to understand the mathematics of a mortgage or the legal weight of a deed, we inherit the exact shape of our parents' fears. We inherit their coping mechanisms, their unhealed wounds, and quite often the generational ledgers they failed to balance. When a mother stands in a quiet kitchen and tears her 18-year-old daughter's college acceptance letter in half, she is not merely destroying a piece of heavy cardstock. She is attempting to enforce a specific, deeply flawed definition of family responsibility. In the story of Clara Morgan, we witnessed a profound distortion of traditional family values. A home where blood was weaponized to demand absolute compliance, and where a child's potential was viewed as a direct threat to the fragile ecosystem of the household. In American culture, the concept of the traditional family is often idealized as a sanctuary of unconditional support. We are taught that family is our baseline, our safety net, the place we return to when the external world becomes too harsh. But what happens when the harshness is coming from inside the house? What happens when the people tasked with guiding a child into the future actively conspire to keep them trapped in the past? The true lesson embedded in the wreckage of Clara's family is a master class in the absolute necessity of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness in parenting. Parenting is not a deed of ownership. A child is not a subsidiary asset designed to subsidize a parent's emotional or financial deficits. Consider Megan's approach to motherhood. On paper, she attempted to present herself as a fiercely dedicated guardian, claiming she needed $60,000 to secure her daughter's place in an elite educational pipeline. But the reality was a grotesque inversion of maternal care. Megan's ultimate sin was not merely the financial embezzlement of Sophia's survivor trust, though that alone was enough to warrant federal prison. Megan's true failing was the absolute emotional erasure of her own child. Sophia was a 16-year-old girl whose hands were stained with engine grease, a girl who spent her afternoons dismantling turbine intake manifolds and dreaming of aviation mechanics. Yet Megan drafted a fabricated, buzzword-filled essay about corporate synergy to sell a lie. She did not see Sophia. She did not value Sophia's actual identity. She only valued what Sophia's existence could be leveraged to extract. This is where the concept of fairness in raising children becomes critical. Fairness is not simply dividing resources equally among siblings. True fairness is the emotional awareness required to see a child exactly for who they are, rather than who you need them to be. It is the courage to nurture their specific, authentic ambitions, even if those ambitions diverge from the family tradition. When we fail to offer children this fundamental honesty, when we force them to wear masks to secure our love, we teach them that their true selves are unlovable. We teach them to become manipulators, or we force them to become auditors, analyzing every interaction for hidden traps. Long-term guidance requires the construction of an environment where a child feels secure enough to fail to grow and to eventually leave. A healthy family structure should be a runway, not a cage. Sharon believed that maintaining the family unit meant forcing the eldest daughters to stay home, shrink their lives, and serve the matriarch. She used guilt as a currency and gaslighting as a management tool. She confused control with love, but love in its truest form is an act of release. Clara's ultimate triumph was not putting her mother and sister in handcuffs. Revenge is a cold, fleeting comfort. The true victory was the creation of the irrevocable educational trust for her niece. In doing so, Clara provided the ultimate model of family responsibility. She did not hand Sophia a stack of cash and a heavy burden of gratitude. She built a financial and legal fortress around the girl's actual dream. The trust was irrevocable, meaning it could not be altered, corrupted, or torn in half by the toxic elements of their bloodline. As adults, when we look back at the architecture of our own childhoods, we often find termites in the wood and cracks in the foundation. We realize that the adults who raised us were carrying their own heavy, unexamined trauma. But understanding their pain does not mean we must allow them to transfer the debt to the next generation. Sometimes the most profound act of family loyalty is being the one who finally closes the corrupted ledger. It is having the strength to say, "This is not who we are anymore." If you have ever had to audit your own family tree to figure out which branches to cut and which ones to desperately protect you, understand the silent, heavy toll of breaking a generational curse. It is a lonely process, often misunderstood by a society that demands we forgive our abusers simply because we share their DNA. If this narrative resonates with the quiet battles you have fought in your own life, I invite you to subscribe to Luke Vengeance. Join a community of people who have learned that true peace often requires building your own sanctuary from the ground up. Drop a comment below and share the moment you realized you had to become the architect of your own future. In the end, the dust settles. The sirens fade, the holidays arrive, and the chairs at the dining table remain empty of the people who once demanded to fill them. You stand in the quiet warmth of a home you built, with your own hands locked securely from the inside. You look at the life you have curated, the peace, the verifiable truths, the chosen family sitting by the fire. You realize that you survived the storm. But as you listen to the wind rattling the heavy glass panes, a quiet, lingering question always remains, hovering just at the edge of the firelight. Once you have built a fortress strong enough to keep the monsters out, how do you learn to finally lower the drawbridge for the people who actually belong inside?